Okay. So the oddest place you've gotten a text or responded to a text
today?
Ever?
I mean, if you can think of it, I have done it.
Oh, I can think of it, but I don't know.
Pool, jumping out of the pool on spring breaks. I got the little ding on my Apple Watch and jumping out to tweet something poolside. That's a fairly good one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Late night.
Late nights. Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, getting woken up in bed because the phone starts ringing and finding out, the Raiders just fired their offensive coordinator at 1 a.m. and then just going, all right, well, I guess I got to deal with this now. My wife has gotten used to it. It's just like, oh, what is it now? My Raiders fired the OC. She's like, again? I'm like, yes. That's what happens.
Take me back to yesterday at this time. What did you think was going to happen?
Cam Moore was obviously going 1. The question at 2 is, were the Browns and the Jaguars going to put together that deal? They'd been working on it for a few days. It wasn't until a couple hours before, though, that it started to become clear this was really happening, and the Jaguars are going up and getting Travis Hunter. At 3, it had been, over the last several days, pretty clear that the Giants were going to go with Abdul Carter and probably try to trade up for a quarterback, which I thought was going to be Jackson Dart. I didn't know, but I thought it was Dart. The real action, I think, began with, obviously, the trade up from 5 to 2, but then it was when we got into the middle of the first round, because this was a draft where there just weren't that many blue-chip type players. And so all of a sudden, when it's, guys are beginning to slide, when the Falcons trade back up and get a second pass rusher, obviously what happened with the Giants there weren't a lot of surprise names in round 1, but there were definitely some surprises just in terms of how aggressive teams were. How many times did you guys on this show probably talk about, there hadn't been a single first-round pick moved? We had not only a handful of trades last night, we had 2 2026 first-rounders change hands. So we're already way ahead of the game here.
How surprised were you Shedeur Sanders doesn't go?
I would say this on Shedeur Sanders. When you talk to people in the league like I have, and to coaches and executives and GMs, I listed him when I wrote my 12,000-word quarterback story as a round 1 to 2 guy. And that's the same one as Jackson Dart, as Jalen Milroe, as Tyler Shuck. All 4 of those guys were kind of bunched together. In the opinion of the people within the league who had studied it, who had interviewed all these guys and done the pro days and the private workouts, there was one quarterback who profiled as a surefire starter, and that was Cam Ward. You got 4 other guys who were kind of on the border, and Shedeur is one of those. Listen, he was a highly productive college quarterback. We know how they turn things around from a 1-win team at Colorado. He's very accurate. He's very tough. People love that about him. But he's not the biggest guy. He doesn't have the biggest arm. He's not an elite athlete, which you would expect being Deion's kid that he would be. And so that just raises questions when your entire game is built off this freewheeling style and every highlight is you scrambling around and throwing off your back foot and things like, there's real questions, is that going to work? Or is he going to have to transition to being more of a Drew Brees style processor? That's one of the most common comps is, from a size perspective, arm perspective, he's very, he's clearly smart, but he hasn't had to really go through progressions, and so it's a learning process. And when you're talking about adjusting your game on top of obviously all the other things that have been discussed about the culture shock of him coming into an NFL building, I'm not surprised. I wouldn't have been surprised if he went in round 1. I wasn't surprised he didn't.
It's interesting that you bring up the processing. I was told the same thing yesterday. And I was told by my source that he didn't have a first round grade on him, and that he wasn't going in the first round, in his opinion. And he said, it's no knock on what he did in college. He was great in college, but there are a lot of guys who are great in college. Mm-hmm. And I said, can you see a comparison between him and Baker Mayfield, size-wise, attitude-wise, confident / cocky? And I think there is a comparison there. But we might look at what Baker does and go, yeah, but we don't like that with Shedeur Sanders.
I think some of the same stuff was said about Baker Mayfield. I recall writing that back in that draft, which was, I think, 2018 was the Baker Mayfield draft. And there were people who he rubbed the wrong way. Baker had some bad interviews. I remember him going to the Senior Bowl, and he was there for like half a day. Yeah. And people were like, we couldn't even get him in the room. And like, just this guy. And you remember all the stuff in college, the crotch grabbing, and he tried to run away from the cops that one time and got taken down. Like, there was just all this, like, this stuff that you were trying to deal with him. And Shedeur doesn't have those things. There's not off-the-field concerns with Shedeur. He's not a party guy. Like, he's all football. The people you talk to, like, he wants to be great. I think the bigger question, besides all the physical stuff I just said, is just when you've only played for your father going all the way back from youth football through high school through college. There's a different accountability structure that comes with that. Was Shedeur Sanders ever going to get benched? If he had a bad game, was he ever going to get benched? Everybody else lives in fear of being benched. You come into an NFL locker room, you're not going to probably have as much input on who your quarterback's coach and your OC are, what plays are called, what the locker room looks like, and and things like that. You're walking into a different type of an environment. And on top of that, the other part of it, and I hate the idea of he's sliding. A, there were a lot of people, like you just said, who didn't have first-round grades on him. But B, there's so few quarterback teams. This isn't like, well, we'll take best player available. We'll take another guard. You don't go, well, best player available. We'll take another quarterback. It's like, no, people don't do that. Last night, there were only really two spots that Shedeur could have gone, and that was the Giants or was to the Steelers at 21. The Giants obviously had Jackson Dart graded above him, which I was told from a football perspective had a lot to do with the ability, just the layers to his game. You can run RPOs and read options and things like Dable did with Josh Allen, like he did with Daniel Jones in Dable's first year when he was the coach of the year and won a playoff game. With Shedeur, that's just not his style of play, so they chose to go a different direction. And that's the other part of it. When I mentioned all these other quarterbacks, so 2 went off the board last night. The next 3, in all likelihood, in some order, will be Shedeur Sanders, Jalen Milroe, and Tyler Shuck. And you could not find 3 more different guys out there. Tyler Shuck is like the processing guy, but he's just tall. He's a pure pocket passer, decent athlete, but not a runner. And he's probably got a limited type of upside. Jalen Milroe is all upside, unbelievable runner, huge arm, just doesn't know where it's going. Can you teach him to improve the accuracy? Shedeur is a much more polished passer than Jalen Milroe, but he's not the athlete. And what this goes back to is when your source is saying that to you, it's about traits. What people have to understand is with scouting, it's not just, well, this guy had the most passing yards. Kyle McCord would go number 1 if that were the case. No, it's what are the traits that project? What do you see this player as in the NFL? One scout told me on Shedeur, their comp was, it's like Geno Smith with a little less arm. And I think that that's probably a fairly, you can argue the comparison, but I think that that's a fair way of looking at it, which is Shedeur, even though he ran around a lot in college, he was running around to throw. He's not a scramble to run guy, pocket passer. And it took Geno quite a while to go from the guy at West Virginia to the one that now has, had this amazing renaissance in Seattle and now Vegas.
We're talking to Tom Pelissero, NFL Network insider. So let the audience understand what you do today with your job. As far as, are you making calls about last night or making calls about tonight?
Predominantly making calls about tonight. Most of my work from last night was sending a series of texts, going to sleep, and then waking up to see what people said because I had to be on Good Morning Football at 7 a.m. today. Now, the rest of today is more about, it's not just, okay, what's going to happen in those first few picks. Every year there's a report, there probably will be one today, that the team at 33 is shopping that pick, and like 2/3 of the time they don't trade it. But that is the next selection. Hey, if you want to come up, because everybody now gets a chance to reset and get the top guy left on your board, we're open for business. You want to pay a premium to come up and get him? You can go ahead and do that. This is also now, over the next really 24 hours, the phase of the draft where any veteran players who have uncertain situations, if they're going to be traded, it's probably going to happen right now. So to take, for example, Trey Hendrickson, who the Bengals have wanted a first-round pick if they're going to trade him. There hasn't seemed to be a lot of momentum or action on that front, while they're also still having conversations about his contract. Well, if you get past the point of even getting a 2 for him, the second round comes and goes. Now you're talking about 2026 draft capital, which doesn't help the 2025 Bengals, who think that they can compete for a Super Bowl right now. And so whether it is, Jalen Ramsey, whether it's some of those tight ends whose names have been out there, Dallas Goedert, Mark Andrews, if it's going to happen, it happens now. But the other thing that you see is as the draft is going on, some of those teams, like let's say you're Howie Roseman and you're shopping Dallas Goedert and you think, all right, the Colts really need a tight end. Like, that's my spot. I'll get a third-day pick for him. And then they go, hey, Tyler Warren just fell in our lap. We got our tight end. They're out of the mix. And so the pool of teams willing to draft gets smaller. Sometimes also you have somebody who gets drafted and you're like, why'd they take that guy when they have this guy? Yeah. And that's because they're ready for him to become available here over these next 48 hours.
If the Steelers don't take a quarterback, finish that sentence.
They better hope that Aaron Rodgers decides to play. They are comfortable with Mason Rudolph as a stopgap type of starter. I think you also have a reflection within the league right now. The 2025 draft may not be good as the 2026 draft for quarterbacks. Think about some of the things that already happened in this draft. The Browns traded back. They didn't take a quarterback. They could still take one. They got 2 of the first 4 picks tonight. But they added a first-round pick next year from the Jaguars, which gives them ammunition. The Rams after trying to trade up. I believe it was for Emeka Egbuka last night. They end up bailing out.
They were looking to get a receiver.
My understanding was there were two teams that were both trying to trade up. It was the Texans and the Rams. And the moment the Bucs surprised everybody by taking Emeka Egbuka, the receiver from Ohio State, the calls stopped. Those teams were calling all the teams above them, and all of a sudden the calls stopped. So that's the belief that Egbuka was the guy. He goes off the board. Rams bail out. They pick up a first-rounder next year, which, if Matthew Stafford continues to be year to year, again, might give you the ammunition to move up.
Is Arch Manning already top of mock drafts?
I think in the early ones, but the early ones sometimes they're not an accurate reflection of where we end up. Cam Ward a year ago was a mid-round draft pick. Shedeur Sanders was the one that everybody was talking about. You know, these things vary, but certainly, I mean, Arch just based on, you know, the lineage and the athletic ability. You know, Quinn Ewers is going to get drafted. He could get drafted tonight in the third round. But, you know, I had one longtime assistant coach who said, like, when you go back and forth, you're watching Texas tape, if you're watching the wide receivers or whatever, so you're watching a cut-up, and it's like, you could tell the difference when the ball is coming off Arch Manning's hand. There's a lot there. There's obviously run ability and athletic ability, which is not generally what the Mannings are associated with. He's going to be a top prospect. But he also hasn't been the starter because Steve Sarkisian had a great deal of loyalty to Quinn Ewers, who won a lot of football games. Quinn Ewers is one of, like, the under-talked-about guys in this entire draft. And it has to do with the fact, much like Shedeur, he is smaller, he doesn't have a big arm, not an elite athlete, but very productive and efficient with what he did, and won a ton of football games on a team that went to the college football playoff twice. They were 11-1 on the road with him as the starter. He's one of two quarterbacks in the last decade to beat Nick Saban at Alabama along with Joe Burrow. Like, you'd think saying that resume, the guy would be going number one, but that goes back to the Shedeur Sanders question. Why isn't he going higher? Well, if his athletic profile compares much more to Quinn Ewers than it might even to Cam Ward, that should help people understand a little more why he's still on the board.
Wildest rumor you've heard?
I mean, there were a few yesterday.
Now, once again, not reporting.
Right. I'm trying to think what the wildest one was yesterday, because some of them came true. I mean, the Falcons coming back up for a second pass rusher was a pretty wild type of a thing. Even the Jaguars trading up for Travis Hunter, that seemed completely wild, and then it ended up happening. I would say we're kind of out of the rumor area of it. But I would say this, all right, for quarterbacks today. All right, I'll give you this one. The wildest rumor, I'd phrase it as more than a rumor, but the wildest rumor is that the third quarterback off the board will not be Shedeur Sanders. It will not be Jalen Milroe. It'll be Tyler Shuck, who was Justin Herbert's backup for 2 years at Oregon. That will shock a lot of people. So brace yourselves for all the talk about Shedeur last night. I'm not saying this will happen, but it's entirely possible he's not the third, maybe even not the fourth quarterback off the board.
Yeah, I know that the Steelers really like him. I was told that yesterday. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to be surprised at that, but only because I had intel that somebody said, don't be surprised that this guy can play in the NFL. Even Louis Riddick said he's a guy who could probably be a quarterback in the NFL for 10 years.
Right.
So I'm like, all right.
He's one of those guys who, you know, again, lacking physical traits in terms of he doesn't have the biggest arm, but he's got NFL size. You know, he's a tall guy. He does have a pretty good arm, and he's been exposed to so much. I mean, think about it, 7 years of college football, which everyone's dream, 7 years in college, well, other than the three major injuries. But he's been around forever, and he's been exposed to all these different systems, all these different coaches. That's why he rose up during the process, was he could sit down, and whatever team he was with, he was like, oh, yeah, I ran that. You know, that was 2019 at Oregon. And so he's really helped himself. The one thing with Shuck, because he's had all those injuries that people get nervous about, and there were a bunch of people who brought this up to me, is you can see it. It's not even so much like a risk of further injury. It's does it impact his play? When the rush is bearing down on him, does he shy away from contact? Does he have a little bit of a flinch to him? That's going to bother some people more than others. But if you're one of those people out of, let's say, the Shanahan-McVay style of offense where you just want him to see it, process it, get the football to his playmakers, you're going to like Tyler Shuck.